Hey guys, today on JD Cars, we're going to be installing this Lemförder full front suspension kit on this 2007 BMW 328i. So I don't know if any of you have spotted this in any of the recent videos, but as you can see here, especially in this lighting, the front right wheel here is tucked in. It's quite a bit more tucked in than the driver's left. As you can see, the driver's left has a perfectly suitable fitment to the car, but the right side here, as you can see, is tucked in probably at least an inch, maybe inch and a half. So that's what really prompted me to do this front suspension kit. But then again, we're coming up on 200,000 miles on this car, which is pretty crazy. And it's definitely a good idea to swap out this front suspension just to do some preventative maintenance, as to avoid having any of the ball joints failing while we're driving the car. So anyways, I want to talk to you a bit more about this kit here. In this kit, we have the upper control arms, the lower control arms, tie rods, and sway bar links. All of these are Lemförder components, and this kit was assembled by Bavarian Autosport. They do these type of kit assemblies for numerous types of parts, such as the dozens of clutch components and hardware that you need to swap out your clutch. They assembled that kit for me, and they can do so for almost any other components of the car. So that's something pretty unique that Bavarian Autosport does, which makes doing repairs like this a lot easier because you don't have to worry about tracking down each and every little part and piece of hardware. Everything's included all in one package. All of these components are of the highest quality, and I'm really excited to get them installed in the car. So I'm gonna pull it in here, we'll get it up on the Max Jacks lift here, and we'll begin our repair. All right, we've got the car up on the lift here. I think I'm gonna tackle the passenger side here first off camera, just because there could be some complications due to that being bent in a bit, and that way I can give you a more educated tutorial on the driver's side there. But before I do, I wanna give a huge shout out to Nick Sadi. I hope I pronounced your last name right. I saw a comment in our most recent video, which was the clutch video, and Nick told me he could see the wire wearing on the inside of my passenger side wheel. I thought, well, that very well could be possible due to the excessive camber on this wheel. And as you can see, the wire is definitely exposed. This tire needs to be replaced as soon as possible. So huge thank you to Nick for pointing that out to me. All right guys, so I'm done with the passenger side here. I have all of the new Lemförder components installed, with the exception of the sway bar link. Because I do have ISC coilovers installed, that sway bar link is a different length than the OEM link, so I'm not going to be installing that. I did definitely learn some lessons removing the OEM hardware here. There's definitely a preferable order for removing and installing these to make things easiest, just because everything in there is really tightly fit. I also did have some difficulty with the fasteners, as you can see. I had to cut the lower control arm nut off of the control arm, as you can see here. Each of the control arms has a male Torx receptacle in the control arm ball joint here, but as you can see, this one stripped right out, and I was unable to remove that nut, so I had to cut it. Luckily, the Lemförder kit includes an extra 21mm nut for your tie rod, so I was able to steal the 21mm nut from the tie rod, and I used it on the new control arm that we installed. As you can see, I also did have to cut the tie rod. Just because of how seized this was, I could not get it to budge whatsoever. So everything went okay on the passenger side here. We just had a couple complications, as you can see. But now we're gonna move on to the driver's side, and I'm gonna show you each and every step necessary. So first and foremost, of course, we're gonna be pulling off the front wheel with a 17mm to remove our wheel bolts. I find it easiest to remove the tie rod here first to allow us room to remove this lower control arm bolt right here. Otherwise, if you try to remove this lower control arm first, you're gonna run into a little bit of an issue here with the colliding bolt and tie rod. Now, an important note, before removing your tie rod, it's important to measure the distance of your tie rod because they are highly adjustable, and that can significantly impact your alignment. Regardless of how well you measure, you are going to have to get an alignment after this. but to minimize how misaligned your car is going to be, it's important to measure that and take note of it for reinstallation of the tie rod later. So first things first, we need to remove a 21mm nut on top of the tie rod right here. I do advise applying some pressure to the tie rod from below using a floor jack. Otherwise, when you go to remove this nut, it's pretty likely your ball joint's just gonna rotate, so this will prevent that from happening. Now I'm gonna come in here with a breaker bar and a 21mm socket to break this nut loose. And I'll switch over to a ratchet here just because it's a bit easier. Now the next step we need to address here is removing the boot to access the inner part of the tie rod here. You may have to rotate your boot a bit to access this restraining band right here. I'm going to use a flathead screwdriver to pop that off and release it. Now you can pull off the boot like so. Now using some needle nose pliers, we're going to remove this clamp on the outer part of the tie rod boot. Just squeeze it together and pull it out towards the rotor. And this will allow us to pull down the boot out of the way, which will allow us to loosen and remove the tie rod from the car. Now this ball joint nut is a whopping 38mm. I do not have a box wrench that size. My crescent wrench didn't even open up big enough, so I had to go and buy a larger crescent wrench. So I'll be using this big adjustable wrench to loosen that up and remove it. Now if you do want to salvage the tie rod, you can use a T50 torque socket to loosen up this bolt right here, which will allow you to unthread the end of the tie rod here, allowing us to remove the boot and the clamp. However, I really don't have the time and energy to fuss with this because, as you can see, it's extremely corroded and seized up, so I'm just going to use my angle grinder and a cutting disc. I'm going to cut that and remove the boot and the clamp. Alright, so boot and clamp retained. Now we can continue with removing the control arms. Next we'll be removing the lower control arm here, and as before, I'm going to apply pressure using a floor jack so we can easily remove that nut. Same as before, we'll remove a 21mm nut on top of the control arm here. I'm going to break it loose with a breaker bar and then use the ratchet to remove it the rest of the way. Now we can pop this down. It won't come down all the way because of the bushing, but we can now remove an 18mm nut on this side. This side is also 18mm. I'm going to hold that with an adjustable wrench. Now we can pull this down, remove the bolt, and remove the control arm. Now we have the upper control arm to remove. This is the last step here, unless you're also doing your stabilizer links. But for me, this is the last component we're removing. And because this ball joint is inverted here, a torque socket is going to be coming into play here. We'll be holding the ball joint in place with a T40 Torx bit, and then we'll be loosening the nut using an adjustable wrench. Now we just have to remove this 18mm bolt in the front of the control arm here. And what's really nice about this is the control arm bolt has a self-retained nut. As you can see, it's a square self-retained nut. You can just hardly see it there, but that means we don't have to hold the nut on the other side. We just have to loosen up the bolt and remove it. So I'm going to break that loose with the breaker bar and remove it with a ratchet. This releases our upper control arm, so we can push it up and pull the control arm out like so. Now I'll reverse the removal process, starting with the installation of the new upper control arm. So we'll get our bushing in place here and install our bolt. Now I'm just going to leave that finger tight until we get this fully installed. So we'll pull the control arm up and drop it into place. Grab our nut and install it. As before, we'll need our T40 Torx bit and adjustable wrench. You need to hold this in place. And to make things a little bit easier for yourself, put your ratchet to the loosening position. Hold this nut in place with your adjustable wrench, and you can pull the ball joint threads down through the nut. This is a bit quicker than using your adjustable wrench, as you can imagine, pulling it off, putting it back on. Once you feel the ball joint starting to make contact, it's stop using this method and switch back to simply holding the ball joint with your ratchet and tightening the nut down with your adjustable wrench. Now I'm not going to tighten down this bolt and bushing until we have all of the suspension components installed, so we're going to move on to installing the lower control arm here. Similar process, take the bushing end and install it in place, grab our bolt, slide it through, and we'll now reinstall our 18mm nut. Again, I'm not going to torque this down until we have everything installed in position. Bring our control arm up and through the steering knuckle, and we'll reinstall our 21mm nut. Now, all of your control arms do have that recessed Torx area to restrain the ball joint from moving, but I find it much easier just to apply some pressure using the floor jack and tightening down the 21mm nut. So that's what I'm going to do here. Now we just need to install a new tie rod here. So we're going to pull off the end of it by unthreading it. I'm going to take the boot that we retained, install it like so, it should click into place, and we can now reinstall this retaining band using some needle nose pliers. Now I'll thread the end back onto the tie rod, and we'll adjust this to the length that we took note of when removing our original tie rod. So we'll begin here by threading our tie rod back into place, and we'll tighten that sucker down with our big adjustable wrench. And we can now bring the tie rod up and into the steering knuckle, and we'll install the included 21mm flange nut. So once we've got our steering boot reinstalled here, we need to reinstall this band. So I'll bring it around, and just a little hint here, this is the part that we actually crimp. You need to pull that apart to give yourself some slack. So once you hook it on like so, we need to recrimp this part together to pull it together and pinch the boot. Now they make a special tool for this. I do not have one, but you can use some diagonal cutters like I have right here. Just have to be really careful not to cut it, but as long as you're careful, you can get away with it. Just three last things we need to do here. We need to tighten down the tie rod restraining bolt right here using a T50 Torx bit. And we have to come back to our true control arms here to tighten down the 18mm bolt in the front and the 18mm bolt and nut in the rear. At this point, the installation of our Lemförder suspension kit is complete, both passenger and driver's side here. So after comparing the camber on the driver's side here and the remaining camber on the passenger side, I do have a fear that this didn't fully resolve that issue. It does appear to have improved it, but after further inspection here, it appears the lower on this ISC coilover may be a little bit warped and bent, which could be causing the problem with the camber. So I'm gonna have to look into that and get a replacement. That's not a major problem, but I'll keep you guys updated. So that's gonna wrap up this video on the Lemförder front suspension kit. It's dinner time now, so I need to wrap this up. I'm gonna reinstall my wheels and my splash guard and clean everything up here, and I'm gonna call it a night. As always, I'd like to pay a huge thank you to Bavarian Autosport for making this video possible. If you need any sort of BMW parts, be sure to check out Bavarian Autosport at bavauto.com. Thanks for watching, guys. Please leave a like below and subscribe for more BMW content, and I'll see you next time on JD Cars.